Are these the cutest little cherubs that have ever been painted or what? They're also, I would say, the most famous putti in the entire world. Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today we're going to have a look at these two guys. They are little angels, cherubs, putti. They were painted by Raphael around 1512 and they have become, as I said, probably the most famous of their kind. Because today, if you walk around the Vatican or the shops for touristy stuff in Rome, you can get t-shirts, mugs, mouse mats and anything else they can be printed on. They have been printed on and you can get them anywhere. So it might surprise you that these two little guys cannot be found in the Vatican. They're not even in Rome, in fact. They're not even in Italy. Today, and for most of the last few centuries, they've been in Dresden. But before I continue, please be so kind as to hit the like button and at any time you feel is appropriate to this video. And of course, if for some odd reason you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, this is the time to remedy that. All you have to do is click the button below the video and then click the bell icon so you get notifications. And it's as easy as that. And it's free, it's fun, and it helps my channel grow. What could be better than that? So back to business. These two guys are actually just details from a much larger altarpiece. It's called the Sistine Madonna. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Sistine Chapel, and it's named more or less after the same guy, which is Saint Sixtus, after whom Pope Sixtus IV was named, and he was the man who had the Sistine Chapel built. He also made one of his nephews a cardinal, and that cardinal would eventually become Pope Julius II. And it was Pope Julius II who had both the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel painted by Michelangelo and had this painting made by Raphael. This portrait, by the way, it was also made by Raphael about a year before the Sistine Madonna. Now, this painting was supposed to be an altarpiece for a church in Piacenza called San Sisto, which means it was dedicated to Saint Sixtus. And because it was made for that church, it is called the Sistine Madonna. And Pope Julius II had it made for that church because his family, and his uncle in particular, had a long-standing relationship with that church. So, let's have a look at it. By the way, we're going to have a look at the entire painting first, and we'll get to the little guys before long, don't worry. But let's have an overall look first. It is a Madonna with child, one of many painted by Raphael, but in the long series of paintings that he made of them, it's one of the last, if not the last Madonna he ever made. And we see her here standing on clouds, meaning that she's in heaven. She appears to us as in a vision. And that has been made more obvious with the curtains that we see at the top. It's almost a theatrical setting where curtains are drawn open to reveal the stage, but in this case it's heaven that opens up for us. Now, in the Bible, there's no scene where this actually happens. In fact, there are no scenes that describe where the Virgin Mary holds her child. There is, however, a legend that Saint Luke was a painter, or at least painted. Again, there's no biblical reason to think that, but it's a tradition that started round about the 8th century. And it states that Luke had a vision in which the Virgin Mary and child appeared to him. And in many cases that vision has been interpreted so that they came in on a cloud. And according to that tradition, he then painted them. Now that legend and belief that St. Luke did that is the basis of so many depictions of the Virgin Mary and child. There are actually some other origins for the image as well, but they are non-Christian, and I should really make a different video about that. But during the Renaissance, it became more and more popular to have altarpieces with the Virgin Mary on a throne, holding the child, and to be surrounded by saints that are painted as if they are in the same space. It's called a sacra conversazione, or sacred conversation, because it looks as though they're just having a chat around the throne. But in this case, we only have two saints that are not just standing around, they're actually active. On the right, we see Barbara. She's a very popular saint, and her attribute is a tower. We see that tower just over her shoulder, peeking out behind the curtain that she's actually holding open with one of her hands. She was a 3rd century martyr saint, and well, there's actually no historical evidence for her story, but she is a very popular saint nevertheless. And in most tellings of her story, she lived somewhere in Asia Minor, and she had converted to Christianity, but her father was against that. He therefore locked her up in a tower in a room with 2 windows, but she managed to get a workman in to install a 3rd one, and even a priest to baptize her. Eventually her father would figure out that 3 windows setup had something to do with the Trinity, and then her father tried to convert her back to the old gods, but he failed, and then handed her over to the Roman authorities, who also tried to convert her back, and decided to torture her and eventually sentence her to death by beheading. Now, when the time came to execute her, her father became so enraged that he took the sword to decapitate her himself. And right after he did so, he was struck and killed by lightning. Now, there's a very good reason she's depicted here. The altarpiece was to be placed in the church of San Sisto in Piacenza, which is not just a church, but also a monastery of the Benedictine order. Now, the male monks have as their main patron Saint Benedict. And the female orders, the nuns, also revere Saint Benedict, but also see Saint Barbara as one of their forerunners, because Saint Barbara refused to marry because of her Christian faith. She is seen as one of the first nuns. The figure we see on the left is a little bit more complicated. It's Saint Sixtus. Now, that seems easy enough, except that there's more than one Saint Sixtus. Let me explain. The first Saint Sixtus was a bishop in Rome, in that he was a forerunner of the Pope. Of course, the bishops of Rome saw themselves as the successors of Saint Peter. Now, in the centuries directly after Saint Peter, the Christian congregations of Rome were tiny. That's why we know very little about them, and that sometimes they were also prosecuted, which is why even the bishops often tried to stay anonymous. In this case, we're not entirely sure if we have his name right. He may have been called Sixtus, which comes from the Greek xystos, which means shaved. But another origin of his name is that he was the 6th bishop of Rome after St. Peter, and in that case his name may have come from Sixtus, meaning the 6th in Latin. If that's the case, and I think it is the most probable origin of his name, he was simply anonymous and we don't know his name, but we know there was someone who was the 6th pope, and so his name is just a number. Now, from pretty early on in Christianity, popes have chosen their own name, and about a century after the death of Sixtus, another pope decided to name himself after him. Maybe he also wanted to be called Sixtus, but he's known as Sixtus II, which, if the first one was a number, is slightly strange. Now, Sixtus II was martyred and became a saint, which means that there are actually 2 Saint Sixtuses. The previous one was made a saint as well. Now, in the 5th century, there was another Pope Sixtus, so he was therefore the 3rd. But he's not a saint, so he's not the one depicted here. And in the 15th century, finally, there was Francesco della Rovere, who became Pope Sixtus IV. He is not a saint, and if they have any sense, he will never become one, because, according to the brilliant historian Barbara Tuchman, he gave new meaning to the word nepotism, and if you ask me, he also did that for the word corruption. But he did have the Sistine Chapel built, which was named after him because everything that's built in the Vatican is named after the Pope who had it built. By the way, this portrait of him was made by Titian in 1540, which is 56 years after Pope Sixtus IV died, so Titian never saw him and based his portrait on other likenesses, like for instance this one, which was made during his lifetime. And one of the things that we can see in that, and actually all depictions of Sixtus IV, is that he was beardless, which could possibly mean that his name was actually derived from Sixtus, which, as I said, means shaved. But I mostly show you this portrait so we can see that he is not the man depicted on the Sistine Madonna, because he looks nothing like it. So that means it must be one of the earlier popes named Sixtus. And since they were both saints, I suppose either one of them will do. By the way, we can see that he's a pope because there's a papal crown in the corner there. But what I really like about him and the way he's placed is that he's talking to the Virgin Mary, or possibly the Christ child, while he's pointing out into the real world, at the people in front of the altarpiece. So he's doing exactly what saints are supposed to do. He's pleading on behalf of mortals, praying in front of the altar, to the Virgin Mary and child. It makes the altarpiece, or the people on it, interact with us. And this is part of the brilliance of Raphael, the way that he plays with the actions of his figures, and in this case also with his audience, because they always interact with each other. Also, both Virgin and Child look directly out of the picture, and that means that they are looking us directly in the eye. This is one of those things that they tell you is special about portraits in haunted houses, that they follow you around a room. But it's not particularly special. It's just someone looking straight out of the picture. I mean, the picture on your driver's license does the same thing. So here, both Mary and Child look directly at us, in our eyes. Even when you're sitting in front of the altar, I guess on your knees in prayer. And it's unusual to see them do that. Look directly at you, that is. The way she's standing, by the way, has often been compared to sculptures from antiquity. One of the founders of the modern discipline of art history, his name is Johann Joachim Winkelmann, compared her to statues of Juno. Now, unfortunately, I'm not really sure which ones he meant, but perhaps it's this one, because this one was already in the Pope's collection in the Vatican, so Raphael could have seen it, and so did Joachim Winkelmann. And it does have a similar sort of strength of body to it, because that is what's so striking about her, that she is a strong figure. Most of the previous Madonnas that Raphael made were mostly elegant or sweet girls that look away meekly. Here she has an imposing look. She's not quite stern, but she's very direct. And she's moving forward. We can see her movement, or we can sense it through the way her clothes move in the wind. Her skirts are being blown to one side, and so is her, veil or scarf. Now, there is some debate about who this model was. Most art historians simply say they don't know who it was, but there's also a group of art historians who like gossip. So let me briefly tell you about that. Raphael was apparently a very nice man. He was charming, witty, elegant, and he was really good company. And this helped his career because he knew how to handle himself in the presence of rich merchants, nobility, and even the Pope. He was also a notorious womanizer. He would often fall in love with women and then chase after them. And according to Vasari, it may have even killed him. Now, this love life of his was a constant factor in his life, but also in his career. You see, soon after he arrived in Rome, or rather after he had had his first successes, there was this cardinal who insisted that he, Raphael, would marry the cardinal's daughter. And Raphael apparently agreed because they got engaged. But it may well be that Raphael didn't feel like getting married to this girl because he never did, and their engagement lasted for over a decade and ended when Raphael died. In the meantime, he had plenty of other girlfriends whom he also didn't marry, although in some cases he even tried. And it didn't help that some popes, well, one in particular, Leo X, offered him the possibility of becoming a cardinal, but in that case, of course, he couldn't be married. But there's one famous story about a girl that he was in love with, and that's the story of La Fornarina, whose real name was Margarita Luti. I think you pronounce it that way. She was the daughter of a baker, and her nickname Fornarina comes from the ovens of her father's bakery. Apparently, they had a relationship, and he wanted to marry her, but she didn't want to. Now, all of that could be just legend, without any historical basis. But it is one of those stories about Raphael, and apparently he painted her twice. Because there's these two very similar women in these two portraits that could well be this particular girlfriend, and their faces look very similar to our Sistine Madonna here. So, is this the same woman? Well, there's a few things to consider here. The story of how he met Margarita, for instance, is when he was working on another project in the Santa Maria della Pace in Rome, which, if true, he would have done after he painted this altarpiece. And the two paintings supposedly of her are both from several years later. So yes, it could be his girlfriend, but it could also be any other model that he kept using for a longer period of time, because it has to be said that even these two portraits, we're not even completely sure that they are La Fornarina. It's just one of those things that we like to think, without all that much evidence. By the way, there's angels or cherubs absolutely everywhere. When we look closer at the background in the heaven that is opened up, it's made up entirely from these little heads of angels. I suppose they are the choirs of heaven. And that, of course, brings us to those two little guys in front that have become so incredibly famous. We have no contemporary source that tells us why he placed them there. We can only see that it's a very successful little motif. And it seems as if he did it on a whim, but I will show you that he didn't. But there's these two stories that were written about this painting and about these two putti, and both were written in 1912 and appeared in different magazines. Both, by the way, lack sources, or at least they didn't give us any. One is Fra magazine. It tells us that these two were the children of the model who came with her to the studio, and they were just bored, and Raphael saw them hanging around, liked the look of them, so he sketched them and later included them in the painting. The other story is that he saw these two boys looking into the window of a bakery where he was, and again he was struck by their look, made a sketch of them, and then included them. Now, this version of the story was published in St. Nicholas magazine, which was a popular children's magazine in the United States early in the 20th century. And it would be nice to have any type of source for either of these stories, but we don't have them. So we can just as easily assume that they were made up at the time. Remember, it's 1912, it's hundreds of years after the painting had been made. And then, of course, we still have no idea why he placed them there. But I can tell you that it wasn't a last-minute addition or a spur-of-the-moment thing after he saw some children looking wistfully or hanging around bored and he just liked the way they looked. Because we can see in the painting that he planned them from early on. Because while they seem to be hanging out on the edge of the painting, Barbara has noticed them. She is looking directly at them. And it's pretty typical for the work of Raphael to have different people in paintings connect with each other by the directions of their gaze. And you can see that Barbara and the little putti are looking at each other. They look back at her. And cute as they are, it becomes even more striking when you realize that this is an altarpiece. This painting used to stand, it used to rest on an altar. So these two little guys are leaning on that altar and they're looking bored. And that makes me even more funny to me than when you see them printed on a t-shirt. Now, these days you can't see this altarpiece in the church it was made for, because, as I said, it has been in Dresden for most of the past 3 centuries. And that's because it was bought by King Augustus III of Poland, who just happened to also be Frederick Augustus II, Elector of Saxony. It's the same guy, just 2 different titles. I'm sure he had a lot more of them. But as Elector of Saxony, he held court in Dresden. And halfway through the 18th century, enlightened rulers, and he very much wanted to be viewed as one of those, needed to collect art. So he bought lots and lots of it. He sent out buyers throughout Europe to get him a comprehensive collection of highlights of art history. And these people were very good at their job. They went all over the place and bought prime examples of the best painters of the previous centuries. And this formed the basis of the collection that is now the Gemäldegalerie Alte Meister in Dresden. And at least part of that museum is still placed within the very court that Frederick Augustus, or Augustus of Poland, had built, which is called the Zwinger. Now these buyers went around Europe looking for art they could buy and went to this little monastery with the church. And monasteries tend to need money, and they just purchased it in 1756. The monastery then bought a replacement, a copy that had been made a few decades before by Pietro Antonio Avanzini, which is this one in this highly Baroque frame that is still in the church of San Sisto. Now, before it was bought by Frederick Augustus, it had been kind of famous because some writers who wrote about Raphael hailed it as his most spectacular Madonna. So that's how experts knew that it was there. But now it came to his collection in Dresden, where the whole point was that intellectuals, art historians, art lovers would visit and write about the collection. Which is exactly what happened. One of those I mentioned before, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who's often called the father of modern art history, wrote extensively about it. And he was far from the only one. And that's how the Sistine Madonna became world famous. Strangely enough, I don't know of any of these 18th century sources that even mentions these little 2 guys at the bottom. But anyway, the Sistine Madonna was first in that private royal collection that you could only visit by contacting its curator directly. You had to write a letter and then ask for permission to view it. But it was open to the general public during the 19th century, pretty much in the museum that still exists today. The only time it was moved was during World War II, when the collection was moved to underground mines. There they had installed all these climate control measures to keep the art in good condition, so that's how the collection survived the bombing of Dresden, by simply not being there. The palace that I mentioned, called the Zwinger, was almost completely destroyed and has been rebuilt since. But after, at the end of the war, the collection was discovered by Soviet troops who took most of it, if not all of it, I'm not entirely sure, but they took this one to Moscow. Apparently because Stalin simply liked it. And it was on display at the Pushkin Museum for about a decade. But after Stalin died and Khrushchev took over, it was decided that it was best for Soviet-East German relations to give it back. Now the Soviets have always claimed that they rescued it because the mine they found it in had not had electricity for some time, which meant that the climate control had failed and the collection was in danger of being destroyed by the wet. And they couldn't place it back in the Gemäldegallery because it didn't exist at the time, it had been mostly destroyed. Of course, it's hard to believe that there wasn't any building still standing between Dresden and Moscow where they could have placed it, so no one really ever took that idea really seriously. But it's back in Dresden and today it's still there, amidst the absolutely wonderful collection that they have there, which really is worth the trip. But before you go there, don't forget to like and subscribe, and perhaps you could even consider sharing these videos with people you think might be interested. And as I said, it's really worth the trip to go to Dresden to see this painting. But if that's not in the cards right now, you could of course see these two on a t-shirt near you. Bye.